it. We have Nick Pilch here, and after he unmutes himself, he's going to give, speak to us for a few minutes and maybe explain how this program between our two groups came about, and whatever else he wants to say.
All right. Well, thank you, Carol. Appreciate that. And thank you, Carol, for having set this up, and Tim for being here. I head the housing team at League of Women Voters, Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville. And if you want to know more about us, you can check the website, lwvbae.org. Look for the housing team, and you can find out when we meet, and et cetera. Our team has wanted to start a series of educational events around housing. And one of the ideas we had was to feature Tim Frank, and do an event with the Environmental Concerns Speaker Series, where we explored the connection between housing and the environment. I'm so glad both Carol and Tim agreed, and here we are. I first became aware of Tim with my work with the Sierra Club. I attended several webinars where he spoke of his work on the Sierra Club's infill housing guidelines. I also encountered Tim at the Sierra Club California's Transportation and Sustainable Communities Subcommittee. I didn't even know all the great things Tim was involved in until his bio was written for this event. It's really, really cool. Anyway, without further ado, I'll pass it back to the environmental concerns people and Carol, and on with the show.
Okay, well, you've all read, I believe, the bio of Tim, but he has been working with sustainable communities for a very long time, and helped with the Sierra Club's coming up with, wait a sec, I'm looking to read what it is that I have to say. Anyway, I'll have to finish this afterwards because I have lost it, and I try to use my phone and the iPad at the same time. But he has been working for many years in coming up with sustainable development situations, and I'm sure we're going to have a very lively talk tonight about different issues surrounding the environment and housing. And he's worked on the BART station at North Berkeley BART, and I believe at the other BART station too, near the Ashby, and many other parts of sustainable development. So let me turn this over to Tim, who will give us his presentation, and then we will converse.
Terrific. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, and now I'm just going to put my thing into slideshow. And I'm going to share a screen with you. Oh, shucks. Sorry. Oh, here we go. Share screen. There we go. Sorry about that. Do you see all of that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it changed.
Sorry about that. So, thank you much for that nice introduction. And, you know, it's really a pleasure to me to actually make a presentation. I've made presentations all over the country, but it's especially fun to do so right here close to home. I've lived in Berkeley since about 1998. And I've played a role in shaping a lot of local policy platforms that have helped in turn shape the environment in ways that I can share with you. And I think that you'll all also be familiar with, because I think a lot of you have seen the development that's happened along San Pablo and development that's happened in downtown Berkeley, et cetera. But I'm going to share with you some of the rationale behind the reason why environmentalists have such a substantial stake in promoting this kind of development. And also want to share with you some ideas about how we should be trying to shape development that does occur to make sure it is as equitable as it can be and as green as it can be. Because if we really do a good job, we can create a win-win-win situation that helps advance social equity, that helps create a healthier environment, and it strengthens our local economy. So there is a real opportunity to get a whole variety of different stakeholders working together around a common agenda that actually builds a bigger pie for everybody and then lets us share it equitably. So I wanted to start by setting the table for this. The context in which we're working is that America has this really unusual economy. When we talk about American exceptionalism, usually we think, rah, 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 we're great at everything, right? But what we forget is that there are actually a bunch of things where we're really behind much of the rest of the world. We use more land, more energy, more building materials per capita than other rich neighborhood countries of the world. And it turns out that's inefficient, that it's a drag on our economy. It's bad for our environment. And we also have more poverty and less social housing than other rich industrialized countries, which means that we have a housing crisis, and our housing crisis is worse than that of any other country that's not at war. Now, I will admit, if you look at Ukraine or you can look at places like Yemen, they have a worse housing crisis than we do. But of countries that are not at war, our housing crisis is the worst of them. So you might ask yourself, why? How can we, despite having one of the most powerful economies on the earth, have so much poverty, have such an incredible housing crisis? And the answer is that it's been driven by a whole series of policy decisions dating back about a century. America developed a zoning practice. When zoning was first introduced in the world. I mean, first it was introduced in Germany, and then it came very quickly to America. And when we first began doing zoning about 100 years ago, the driving force behind our idea behind our use of zoning tools was that we were trying to segregate. So we created a zoning policy that was compromised by these racial politics. And it turns out we have housing policy compromised by racial politics that was utterly horrible. We wanted to, first of all, segregate, and that meant that we deliberately created cities with neighborhoods in them that were so expensive that every single home in the entire neighborhood was so expensive that a person of color or a low-income white person couldn't live there. That is a really kind of weird thing to do that other countries didn't do. And our transportation policy is also compromised by racial politics. So we disinvested in transit and instead invested in highways that would allow us to connect jobs to newly built segregated neighborhoods. And we did this in every state of the union. And as a consequence, we have a huge amount of sprawl and we have a huge amount of segregation. And it also turns out that we have labor policy that's been compromised by racial politics. So we actually have the weakest union rules of any OECD country, which basically includes all of the wealthy industrialized democracies. And we have a huge amount of low-wage labor as a consequence. So we have a tremendous amount of inequality. So one of the consequences of this is that because we built the huge amounts of single family neighborhoods, our communities take up a huge amount of space, and the average distance between different uses is much higher than it is in most countries. And so we have to drive longer distances. So Americans drive more than literally anyone else on Earth. And since transportation is a huge share of our greenhouse gas emissions, about a third of them, and about 70% of all of our oil use, this is a big deal. So if you look at how we actually implemented the policies that drove all of this, we had Hoover zoning codes. These were single family districts. We specified wide streets and lots of off-street parking. And we created single-use zones. So we had residential areas that had no commercial areas. And then we had commercial zones that were purely commercial and where it was illegal to build an apartment. If you look at older neighborhoods built but before the introduction of zoning, you can find them whether in Berkeley, or you can look out on the in Alameda, or in lots of places, you'll find these old main streets that look an awful lot like a main street you see in a Western, where it's not one story, but two-story construction, right? And there's residential above retail. You can go out to the city of Alameda today and look at some of the old main streets there, and you'll find that because they never got redeveloped in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, these historic neighborhoods are still intact. And you'll find that there are actually apartments above retail in their little Main Street districts. And that used to be one of the most common land use patterns in old, Main Street settings everywhere in the country, until we introduced zoning and started to make that illegal. And the reason we made it illegal is because wealthy neighborhoods did not want to have apartments above the stores in their little Main Street, because apartments would mean people of color. And if you wanted to make sure that there were no apartments in your wealthy neighborhood, you had to make sure that your little Main Street didn't have any apartments. And so we created the modern, what we call it, Euclidean zoning, which was a single use. So both residential and the commercial were separate. And on the residential side, the main emphasis was on trying to provide single family zoning for everybody who could afford it. And then the unspoken side effect of that is everybody else got squeezed into what were then considered the apartment districts, which were low rent districts where people of color and low income white people would live. And we created a pattern where the assumption was that if people lived in apartments, they would be poor. And we created something that's really destructive, which is concentrated poverty, right? So we took our low-income people and we put them all together instead of having them spread out equally among the neighborhoods. When you have mixed income neighborhoods, that's much healthier for society than when you segregate based on class. Now you might ask, why did we bother to segregate based on class? And the reason for that is a constitutional amendment that said we will make no law that discriminates on the basis of race. And single family zoning was a way to create apartheid without running afoul of that particular constitutional amendment. So this odd little workaround ended up becoming the law of the land. And now single family zoning, which was designed to segregate, is the 70% of all the residentially zoned land in the entire country fits this model. And it's a model that you do not find in other countries. You'll find individual homes that are single family, and sometimes you'll find a subdivision or two that are single family homes. But what you don't find is massive tracts where it's illegal to build anything else. That is a uniquely American phenomenon. So here's a comparison between a suburban setting at 8 units per acre. Now, this, just so you know, is about twice as dense as the average modern suburb, but it's about the density of a streetcar suburb. And what you find in, say, North Berkeley or in Kensington, et cetera, is about this level of density. And we're comparing that to a more urban setting that's about 40 units per acre, which looks more like a typical European city. And what you'll find is, if you're comparing them in terms of greenhouse gas performance, that the more urban, the higher density urban form is actually dramatically better. And it's better across a variety of different metrics. The buildings are more efficient. Now, this is partly because when you build little short buildings with a roof over one story or 2 stories, you waste a lot of heat. And it's also true that when we build at lower densities, we tend to build, say, bigger homes, like a 2,000 square foot home instead of a 1,200 square foot home. The difference in terms of both the material inputs and in terms of the energy it required to heat and cool it is pretty significant. And when you build at lower densities, then the average distance between all of your uses is higher. So it means you have to drive more. So that means your transportation emissions are higher. And then when you look at the total, it's substantial. So in this comparison, you see 50,000 pounds of CO2 per household per year for the suburban versus 20,000 pounds of CO2 per year per household for the more dense urban setting. And if you were actually to look at what happens if you go not just to 40 units per acre, but to 100 units per acre, you'd have yet a larger increment. It would be even more efficient. And if you were to go to 200 units per acre, it would be even more efficient yet. And you can get to a remarkably high level of density before you reach your peak, at which you've optimized for CO2 emissions. And as a practical matter, there isn't anywhere locally where we're likely to get near that peak. So if you look at all the inputs associated with sprawl versus more denser development, it's more pipe and wiring, more lumber, more autos. And by more autos, I mean, when you look at a city like San Francisco, not only are people on average driving fewer miles, but the typical household owns fewer cars. And it turns out it takes a lot of environmental inputs to build a car, not just to drive one, but even to build it. So there's benefits to actually having a lower ratio of autos per household. And this is a benefit that virtually every European nation has been able to take advantage of. But in America, we have lots and lots of automobiles, and our residents have to drive lots and lots of miles. And then, as I noted, the lower density development requires more energy for heating and cooling. And then in the lower density neighborhoods, it means that we have to have a lot longer streets, more pavement set aside for parking lots, et cetera. And all of that means more heat island effect. It also means all the environmental inputs there, because that's a lot of asphalt or cement, which are themselves pretty environmentally costly to make. And because it takes up more space, we lose a lot of land. The average, America uses about 4 times as much land per capita as virtually any European country. And so that means that we've lost a lot of land to sprawl that would in Europe remain pastoral, either as farmland or as habitat or forest land. But anything but sprawl. But here, we've converted a huge amount of land, much more than is necessary. And it also consumes a lot more water. And this is pretty easy to understand. If you're looking at sprawl, you're looking at side yards, front yards, backyards, all of which require water. And when you build on a more compact basis, then there's a lot less yard that you actually have to water. So it turns out that building at a higher density is also creating better human habitat. Now, here's a really interesting little slide. It's looking at the comparison between US and a variety of other countries in terms of the percentage of obesity and the percentage of walking and cycling and public trans use. And when you're building at higher densities, people walk more, they take transit more, and they're able to bicycle more. Our communities have been built around the idea that you have to drive for every trip. And it turns out that that's actually pretty unhealthy. And it's expressed in the terms of fitness. You look at all of these European countries, from the UK, France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, they're all way, way, way fitter than we are. And it's largely because just the way they organize their daily life. They walk more, they bike more, because their communities are set up so these are really easy things and safe things to do and attractive things to do. And it's a little bit harder to drive there because their communities aren't designed around providing parking spaces in front of everything. So here's one of the goals we've got. If you build smart growth, and it means you keep sprawling subdivisions from spilling onto landscapes like this. What I wanted to note here is that it is that smart growth is not just an urban center function. What you're looking at here is a small Swiss village. This is not just historic development. A lot of these buildings were built post-war, but what you see is fairly dense. What we think of as being essentially a density associated with an urban center in America, and yet this is a relatively small town in Switzerland. And because it was built at a very high density, it didn't take up a lot of space. So there's a huge amount of open space around it. And that's really attractive. And, you know, I could have actually picked just about any European country and found an example like this that looks a lot like this, a little white village in Spain, or I could have gone up to Norway and found something cute there. And it would illustrate the same point. So next, I want to actually pay a little attention to some of the social equity challenges. And what you're looking at here is policy that was written by the Sierra Club. And I had a hand in shaping this, and I'm kind of proud of that. But I think it's really important because as we think about trying to build more environmentally sustainable development so that we can save farmland and save the planet and reduce climate emissions, we have an opportunity to also reintegrate our neighborhoods. And to the extent that we pay attention to how things are built and who builds them and under what circumstances, we can think about eliminating some of those low-income jobs and replacing them with higher-income jobs. And that will actually tremendously advance the prospects of social and economic equity. So what the Sierra Club says about this is that development should honor and support the right to organize and promote quality union jobs and livable wages for both construction work and the permanent jobs that follow. Construction work should pay prevailing wages and should utilize apprentices. Now here I should note that prevailing wage and apprentices are kind of connected themes. This has been true since the New Deal era, when our labor laws were first put in place during the Roosevelt presidency. And the idea was that instead of relying on low road sort of sweatshop labor to do construction, we would commit ourselves to a package deal where we would rely on workers who participated in apprenticeship programs. These are 3 to 5 year programs that teach people to work at a high level of productivity and to do very high quality work. And then we would pay them an advanced wage that is much higher than the minimum wage. And in fact, it's a pretty good middle income wage. And the idea is that these people who had been trained and that we were giving all these skills would earn a wage that's much better than they were able to earn before they had access to the union system. And if you look at the comparison between union and non-union work today, you find still that there is a dramatic contrast between both the pay and the quality of the work that you see expressed in higher quality product, buildings, et cetera, and in the safety of the work. So on the sweatshop model, you actually have the non-union side where you have fatality rates that are among the highest in the entire economy. And that's sort of the definition of a sweatshop is the combination of low wages and high hazard. And you have that in the non-union construction world. But on the union side, you have much higher level of safety. You've got good middle-class wages. You have paid healthcare. And you have high quality of work and high productivity that are ultimately good for the economy and good for workers. And then the second, key equity issue is that addressing segregation. Every neighborhood should host its fair share of affordable housing through equitable zoning, regulation, and investment. And when we say equitable zoning, regulation, investment, that means equitable zoning means that you're deliberately zoning so that you can mix products such as apartments and single-family homes and larger homes all in the same neighborhood. So that you can have the people who are, your trashmen or your janitors or your teachers living in the same neighborhood as your managers and lawyers, etc. And one of the benefits of creating mixed income neighborhoods is that when you have a metropolitan landscape that is segregated by class, so that everybody has to choose where they live based on where they can afford to live, then it's difficult for them to live near where their job is. But when every neighborhood has its fair share of all different types of housing, then it becomes easy for people to make location decisions based on where their job is and what's convenient. And then they don't have to commute so far. And that's good for the environment. That also is good for the economy in a variety of ways, because they don't have to waste a lot of time commuting and instead have both higher on the job and off the job productivity. They have better lifestyles it is just better for everybody. Now, regulation. This is the introduction of things like rent stabilization. Rent stabilization is a form of regulation of the housing stock, and it helps make sure that renters don't face a price shock that happens when a landlord decides that they're going to raise the rent by 20% in a year. If instead they're regulated about how much they can raise the rent, that creates a stability for the renters that is very important. This is a tricky area because it's possible to overregulate, and if you do so, you'll discourage new construction. But if you're careful and your rent regulation is moderate, then you can get the benefits of rent regulation without unduly discouraging new development. And that's kind of the sweet spot that we want to push for. And then finally, there's investment. We know that for low-income individuals, the market's just not going to be able to afford to build housing for them that is decent housing. So we need subsidies. And everybody else basically has to help pay for this. We need employers to be paying funds. We need wealthy residents who are using lots of services to help pay for this. We need virtually every sector to contribute their own fair share. And so if many people are working together on this, you have the advantage of many hands making light work. And then ideally, you can actually pay for as much social housing as you really need. Now in America, because we have more low-income workers than all the other wealthy democracies of the world, we have a big gap. And we also happen to have less social housing than all the others countries. So if you compare the US to, say, Austria, which has done a fabulous job of building social housing to the extent that they literally have no homelessness. And we have a lot more low-income people and a lot less affordable housing. So what happens in America is that most of the people that need affordable housing are forced to live overcrowded or with severe rent burden. You know, you actually have people who are paying as much as 60% of their income just to pay for rent. And that means that they struggle to figure out how to pay for food and medicine and for their kids. And they have to make appalling choices that nobody should have to face. But for the most part, that doesn't occur in Austria, right? You look at Vienna's housing stock and they have housing for everybody. And here's the really remarkable thing about it. Their country does not pay more for it than we do. They just use their money a lot more efficiently than we do. So our process has been really inequitable, really inefficient, and it's left us with a crisis that most of us accept is unacceptable, right? We know that lots of homelessness is not good for us. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for our quality of life. It creates policing problems. It creates all kinds of problems, and there's just no excuse for it because there are better ways to approach these things. So when I say development should be dense, dense is a relative thing. What you're looking at here is Rosaleda Village. This is in Wasco, which is in the southern Central Valley. It's surrounded by farmland, and every single one of the homes you see, these are all little quadruplexes. This is all farm worker housing. And it's pretty dense for that setting, and that is appropriate. You would not want to put this right next to a BART stop, where you have a huge investment in an urban transit system. But for a small farm worker town, this is absolutely perfect. And in the foreground, you see the common open space. So instead of emphasizing a big front yard, backyard, and side yard for every single unit, what you have here is the homes you have multifamily homes with not a lot of space between them, but you have a generous amount of common space that actually provides a lot higher quality amenity for the kids to play in. And this is actually something that is really an important concept, because when people wonder about, well, where are my kids going to play? It turns out it's much more efficient to set aside some acreage for parks and then not try and have every single home provide all its own open space. And the result is you actually have big enough areas where kids can throw a Frisbee and it's safe, and dogs can run free. And there's all kinds of benefits that you get from having larger community parks. And you see at the bottom that development should be dense, inclusive, located within or connected to existing communities. That's straight out of the Sierra Club's policy. What you're looking at here is in Grass Valley. The setting around it is a neighborhood built in the 1920s. It looks an awful lot like Kensington, like North Berkeley. There are craftsman homes. They're beautiful. They're a little larger on average than most of our local homes. In our area, we have a streetcar suburb. They did not. So they were built on a slightly larger average lot than ours were. But otherwise, the homes look very, very similar, largely because they were built in the same era. And what you're looking at here is actually new construction that fit into that neighborhood. And that the neighborhood surrounding it is all single families, but this is a new multifamily unit. There's 8 homes in a building that looks like it just fits into that neighborhood. If you were walking down the street and nobody told you that this one was new, you wouldn't know it. And most people don't. It fits. So this is an example of where smart design can actually create something that is aesthetically pleasing and that allows lower income families to move into fairly wealthy neighborhoods without scaring people, and while maintaining a pretty high quality of aesthetic value. You're looking at here an example of development supported by the Sierra Club. This is in the town of Windsor, which is in Sonoma County along the Highway 101 corridor north of Santa Rosa. The town of Windsor is a post-war suburb, and until this development was built, they didn't have a single building in town that was more than 2 stories tall. It was mostly based on pure sprawl. There was single-family zoning, and there was sprawling commercial development that had no apartments. It was just pure commercial, classic post-war pattern. And a developer named Orrin Thiessen proposed to create a town center where there would be denser housing that was in a mixed use format. If you look at the ground level, you see all those windows. That's commercial. So this is an example of vertical mixed use with housing over commercial at the ground floor. And this is the kind of development that, as I was noting earlier, existed in main streets all over the country before we made it illegal. But when we bring it back, we can create a new, an old pattern that was actually very sustainable. So what this does is it allows people to live near their shopping. It makes a very walkable area. And what you don't see in this picture is that on the other side of the street is a park. There's actually a park around which you have this dense development on all 4 sides. And it creates a real town center. And it's something that the town of Windsor didn't have before. And when the developer proposed to do this, he ran into a huge amount of opposition from people who were afraid about the new density and how terrible it would be. But if you look at Windsor today, they celebrate the town square, and people are really proud of what they would be probably embarrassed to admit that many of them complained about before it actually got built. And the result actually looks pretty good. I mean, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. He paid attention to architecture and created something that looks nice. And now some people complain that it looks like it's fake historic. And I'm actually okay with that because there is this really, really long-standing tradition of architecture of doing fake historic stuff. I can show you 16th century or 17th century architecture in Italy that is borrowing from Roman times and that is now celebrated as masterful, just absolutely beautiful, in which the columns aren't really real anymore. They're just a facade on buildings, but you end up with this beautiful set of looking buildings. And so what Orrin Thiessen did here is he borrowed from a historic patterns of architecture and created something that's new, that looks a little bit old. And for the most part, people look at that and they understand the history. They know what old main streets look like, and they find this generally pleasing. And I'm one too. I actually like the aesthetic. I think he did a nice job. Here is an example of a picture from Berkeley's downtown of a proposal for a tall building. And I just want to take a moment to say that I've actually played a substantial role in shaping the development of Berkeley's downtown. I helped work with all these other stakeholders on the development of the plan for the downtown. And then I was responsible for managing the ballot measure in 2010 that established this as the law of the land. And it allows buildings up to 18 stories, which is the height of the tallest building that at that point existed in Berkeley. Just in the downtown, but it also provided for a bunch of other features. So for instance, a new investment in the ground level landscape so that we create even better pedestrianscapes in the downtown with new landscaping and better accommodations for buses and for transit. And at the same time, this development has to contribute to community benefits, including more affordable housing and good union jobs. And it also has to be very green. So that building you're looking at is required to be and is now LEED Gold, which is great because it means that it uses energy and water much more efficiently. The building materials that were used to construct it were sustainably sourced. And all of that matters a lot in terms of actually providing better environmental performance. And we're actually getting that because we encoded it in policy. So here's that hotel that you saw as an artist rendering under construction. And here's that hotel in its completed form. And to the left, you'll see this newly constructed BART Plaza with new landscaping. And it's a really attractive area. And it is just a thriving spot now with there are tables out there where people can eat their lunch. And it is a vibrant location. So it's actually created a really good setting for local restaurants and the little gelato place, etc. The businesses surrounding this are all thriving. And the hotel is actually providing an opportunity for people who are visiting Berkeley to get a good hotel close to the campus. And it's actually means that fewer people have to commute from down by Emeryville, where a lot of people visiting the campus had to go before Berkeley worked on trying to acquire as much hotel capacity as it really needed for its existing needs. So there are tremendous environmental benefits from having the additional hotel capacity here. It was built LEED Gold, and it was built by all union labor under a project labor agreement. And so all of that actually is helping make the area more sustainable, and it will pay over the long haul a huge amount of new hotel occupancy tax to the city that will improve our tax base. It's a benefit in terms of municipal finance. So this is an example of infill development providing a broad suite of benefits. Now in the downtown, we're going to get more buildings of similar or even greater height that will mostly be residential over ground floor retail. And the many thousand units that those new residential structures will bring to the downtown will have a huge benefit in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The campus of Berkeley is actually the largest employer in the East Bay. And the student population has such a shortage of housing that you find students going as far as 10 or 15 miles away to find housing. You can go out to Hilltop Mall and you'll find that there's a surprisingly large percentage of the occupants in the apartment dwellings in that area that are students from UC Berkeley. And when we create housing capacity proximate to the university itself, it means that people can avoid all of that commuting and instead live a lifestyle where they don't need a car at all. All they have to do is walk. And that's the real benefit of bringing a huge amount of new housing to the downtown Berkeley. This is also in the downtown. This is built on what was formerly a surface parking lot, and the zoning made possible by the 2010 Measure R allowed this to happen. This is a project that was built by a combination of Bridge Housing and Berkeley Food and Housing Project. And it serves formerly homeless, and so there's transitional housing here, and with a full suite of services. So they've got everything they need, from social services to on-site commissary to provide food for them, etc. And it's actually a remarkably beautiful building. The artist rendering doesn't really do full justice to what this building is. Here it is under construction. And I don't, sorry, I don't have a picture of the completed project, but it's actually really quite beautiful. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is looking at what a unique set of opportunities that we find in big metro areas is when you have a big parcel of land that you can develop. These are where you can put not just a building, but you can think about an entire neighborhood and doing something really interesting with a mix of commercial and residential and new parks, etc. And typically, large parcels that are available for infill are located in settings where there are problems in the community that the new development can help fix. In this case, this is a racetrack that was a former racetrack because it's now gone, but it was located in the city of San Mateo. And there was a couple of racetracks in the Bay Area, and we actually have one of them locally. So when this racetrack closed down, the Sierra Club and the local building trades and housing advocates worked together to negotiate with the developers and with the city regarding the zoning that would apply to this, and used smart growth principles as their guide for what they looked for. And so this is what the plan for that area looks like. And you can see that there is a large park. There's some smaller community parks, and there's these wonderful paseos. And though this particular plan doesn't really tell you what's commercial and what's residential, there's a mix of both of these, and it's a remarkably well thought out whole neighborhood. There's over 1,250 homes, and I should note that there were complaints. There were people who opposed this development who wanted this to be principally more single-family residents. And the environmentalists, the Sierra Club and Greenbelt Alliance and others that were engaged in advocacy around this asked for higher density. And what we got was higher density with good design that is attractive, that includes good landscaping and all of the things that make an attractive neighborhood. And we also asked for affordable housing. So you had environmentalists joining housing advocates asking for an appropriate component of affordable housing. And in this case, it was about 190 out of those 1,250 homes that are made available to low and very low income households. There's also 1.25 million square feet of commercial. So you have housing and jobs combined, and people who are working in these commercial facilities can live nearby. That's a great combination. And 15 acres of new open space. This is out of an entire parcel that was 85 acres. So there's a significant chunk of land that was put aside for a combination of large and medium and small parks. And there was a project labor agreement, which assured that all of the construction of the entire project, all the commercial, all the residential, everything, was creating good union jobs. So now I'm going to want to show you something local. Let me see if I can't figure out how to put this into slideshow. Oh, shucks. If somebody can advise me, I might be able to figure out how to. Well, this will work well enough. So this is San Pablo. And just so you know, the set of pictures I'm going to show you here.
I
cannot see it.
I don't think we're seeing the right screen.
They don't see it.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to stop share, and then I'm going to share again. Thank you, by the way, for helping me with the technical piece. Share screen. Here we go. Share. Ah. Slideshow. How do we do this? It's does somebody know what it there?
If you pull down the slideshow again, wasn't there an option to start slideshow? Let's see. Play from start.
Oh, okay. So for anybody that wants to look at the recording, they could see a whole bunch of slides from another presentation I had made in the past. And there's a lot of interesting detail in there. But this is actually an example of a location along San Pablo Avenue. And this was a photo that was taken many years by Steve Price of Urban Advantage. He is a local treasure who has provided these slide sequences. What he does is he's somebody that had an architectural background who started a business that was providing photorealistic interpretations of what new development would look like. And he has provided illustrations of how you could redevelop sprawling main streets all over the country. So if this is a photo of existing conditions at the time that he put this together. Now, subsequently, there's been some real development that's happened here, but what I'm going to show you is just his interpretations of what development might have looked like. So he had taken pictures of buildings and created this massive library from which he could take existing pictures and kind of slot them in at the right place in the photograph that created a very, very realistic view. And it's been really important because people are afraid of density. And when you can illustrate what it looks like, it makes it a lot easier for planners to say, hey, this is not going to be scary. It's something that can work for us. And so Steve Price has just individually played a huge role in making it easier for communities all across the country to actually zone for infill development and to allow construction to actually happen. So here's the existing conditions, and here's what happens. And when you bring in some street trees and you actually bring development up to the street front so that you don't have big gaps occupied by parking. And then you can add things like bulb outs here. This is what happens at the corner. It narrows the street right at the corner and makes it safer for pedestrians. And then you can start adding height. And so what this picture is showing is what it looks like to bring your height up to about 3 stories. And then you can add even extra height. And that looks a little more like what we now actually see occurring along significant parts of San Pablo today. And then you can, if you really want, you can get really aggressive and add much taller buildings into that mix. And the result can actually be really pretty. If you've got the right kind of landscaping, and if at the street level, you've got a lot of what you see on the ground level is what would be considered by planners to be a very active street front. People have windows that they can look in. They're protected from along the sidewalk. They're protected from fast moving cars by parked cars along the edge. So this is an example of a place where pedestrians are going to feel very comfortable. And it's also what you are looking at is a lot higher density that allows a lot of people to live along this commercial corridor where you could run transit or buses and it would work. You would actually have a big enough population to actually support the kind of regular transit service that makes it practical for people and convenient for people to actually use transit. In the current moment, what we've also seen is that if you look at the conditions at the beginning, of this sequence. This is a recipe for a failed retail strip. And when you look at the impact of the internet on retail, because the internet has grabbed market share from brick and mortar retail, over the last 20 years, we actually have found ourselves in a situation where a town of a given size can no longer support as much brick and mortar retail as it was designed for in most cases. And so what we have is a crisis where we have too much retail in a market that can't support it, because people are buying from the internet rather than walking to their local store or driving to their local store and buying stuff at the local store. But communities that have a lot of density near their retail can actually support a lot more retail and keep it much more vibrant. So there are some real benefits in terms of quality of life that are associated with having this density around your retail. Because you can keep a really active, vibrant Main Street scene in a setting that has a bit of urban density to it, and that's something that everywhere in the country we're going to be looking for. And when people are thinking about what do we do with a failed mall, then the answer typically is going to be today. And people who do mall development are beginning to recognize this, that the very most productive model is one that doesn't look like the redevelopment that you saw in El Cerrito, where they repackaged it and put some commercial buildings around the sides of it, so that you didn't just look at these huge parking lots, but it was still single use. The much better format is something that looks like the Santana Row in San Jose, where you actually have several stories of housing above the retail, and where you have this mix of retail and housing, such as you see right here. But you can do that same kind of mix in a mall where you're redeveloping a mall, and you can replace the surface parking with structured parking and fit an awful lot more both commercial space and residential space into what was once just a wasteland of a huge amount of surface parking. So generally speaking, whether we're looking at a Main Street context or whether we're looking at redeveloping a mall, the ideal is to create higher density and a mix of uses. And this ends up providing a higher quality of life, better tax base, the possibility of supporting transit usage, etc. So that was kind of a big dump, a lot of information, and I'm sure that there are lots of questions, and I like answering questions. So I was hoping that I could turn it over to you all to sort of help guide the discussion from here on out.
Great, because we promised you that we would stop in a half hour at 9 o'clock, and which is a little less than a half hour, and we have a couple of questions already in the chat. One is Bay Meadows is near the sea. Will rising sea levels affect this? And then she puts, whoops, thinking of our Berkeley racetrack. That's the Berkeley Albany racetrack, which is coming up for some other use.
Yeah, it's true of both. Bay Meadows was basically built it's on the other side of the highway from the ocean, from the bay, but it is roughly at sea level. All of the neighborhoods, the commercial areas, everything that surrounds it was built roughly at the sea level plane. So yes, as sea level rise happens, all of that area is going to need to be protected. There's just no question about that. That doesn't mean it was wrong to develop that area. I mean, what would you have done with it? I mean, were you going to sacrifice all the surrounding neighborhoods and the highway and everything else? I mean, no, the answer is no. We were going to have to protect that anyway. But instead, what we have is a racetrack that was proximate to a rail line that runs the length of the peninsula. And we put a sustainable, relatively dense development around that is served by Caltrain. And the result is actually better for the whole peninsula. It will make it a much more sustainable, make Silicon Valley more sustainable. It's it was the right choice to do. I mean, if I were thinking about how to idealize that property, I would actually have built it to a higher level of density than they did. The residential component was mostly limited to 3 stories. And the reason it was constrained by a ballot measure that was put in place back in maybe 1980s, something like that, or maybe 1990. I don't remember how long ago it was. It was Measure P in the city of San Mateo.
We have a legal question for you, which is, you had put in your biography that Measure U1 created a permanent source of funding for affordable housing.
Correct.
And I don't remember that, but also when you say affordable housing, there's affordable housing at one level, which is at a much higher level of, you know, what of income. And then you have affordable housing for the real poor people who really are not making over 50, 60, $80,000 a year. So what is the permanent source of funding for affordable housing? And is it low-income housing or very low-income housing, or both?
All of the above. But you ask actually an interesting question. So if you look at Measure U1, it taxes landlords basically by requiring an elevated business license tax for landlords. So people who, it's large landlords, because very small landlords are exempted from it. But large landlords who have large apartment complexes in Berkeley, which is actually one of the strongest rental markets in the East Bay, now actually have to contribute a business license fee that the city may use for affordable housing. And it was suggested in the measure that the intent was to try and use this for affordable housing. And there is a mechanism by which there is required transparency. So the funding, there is a community advisory committee that provides suggestions for how the funding should be used. And that community advisory committee is made up of people with the relevant expertise that you would want on such a committee if it were looking at creating, using the funds to address affordable housing. It does not specifically require the city council to do that. And the reason it does not is because that would have triggered a 2/3 requirement. And we wanted to go for a majority vote. And that's because of what I consider to be bad policy that has been implemented at the state level regarding how we pass measures for taxes. But if you look at the actual practice of the city since Measure U1 was put in place, you'll find that the dollars have been used as specified for affordable housing. So that project that I showed you, the Berkeley Way project that has for the homeless, that was substantially paid for with U1 funds. That wasn't the only source of funding. There was also tax credit financing for that, but it was a local match for those. And so, you know, from my perspective, that's really a tremendous success, because there you're looking at not just low, but principally very low and even extremely low income residents.
I have another question for you, but many years ago, Berkeley, especially in West Berkeley, had a very large group of Berkeley Black Property Owners Association members. And that group doesn't seem to exist anymore. And many of those properties that they owned have probably are not, I mean, you were saying racial policy was put in there to keep Black people out, but then here was a neighborhood within Berkeley that was very Black and is not very Black anymore.
Yeah, so you know,
Can you comment on that?
Sure. No, that's a really interesting point. When Berkeley first established single family zoning back in 1916, we were the first city in the entire country to do so. And over the next couple of decades, among the neighborhoods that decided they would welcome single-family zoning was one that actually had a large proportion of African-American residents. Berkeley's not the only city in the entire country that has single-family neighborhoods that actually started out with some African-American residents, but they're very rare. There are not a lot of these. And if you look at the long-term trajectory, what you found is that those neighborhoods are actually fairly vulnerable to gentrification. And that's actually what's happening today. If you look at West Berkeley, you look at the people who are selling homes, and they're more likely to be African American. If you look at the people who are buying homes, they're more likely to be white or Asian, either one, because those are the populations that in this area are more typically earning the incomes that can actually support the purchase of a single family home in Berkeley. Even in West Berkeley, we're looking at average prices that are pretty astronomical. So, I mean, I saw that happen on my own block, where a few years ago, there was an African-American who sold, and guess what? The person who moved into that home worked for the tech industry. So what ended up happening is the elderly African-American woman actually sold. She took her the money and she moved to some place that was less expensive, and she had money to pay for her living expenses, and it worked for her. But the change that for the neighborhood meant that we were losing our diversity, and that is what is happening in those areas of Berkeley that are zoned as you suggested.
There's a very good question here in the chat. Someone writes, informative, thanks. I don't understand how we can eliminate the number of cars we assume we can. A huge draw to Bay Area living is the access to outdoors and regional travel during free time. This requires cars. Housing should be planned simultaneously with public transit, as well as reasonable assumptions about access to activities through cars. Why don't I hear about such considerations when housing is discussed?
Well, if you want more transit, this single most effective strategy to help make it possible to afford more transit is to create more density. So because at an average of say 4 units per acre, you'll never be able to afford transit. At 8 units per acre, you can afford minimal transit, but not very robust transit. You really need higher densities if you want the kind of universal transit that allows people to go from any neighborhood to any other neighborhood. Those are circumstances you can find in Europe, but European metropolitan areas are all universally much denser than here. And as a consequence, you can run buses more frequently, and buses won't be empty, right? There will be enough population to get on them. And that's the fundamental economic determinant of the success of transit. Because if you can't load up your bus with and run it full, or at a reasonable occupancy level, then it just becomes inefficient to try and make it work. If you have empty buses all the time, which is what you have with inadequate density, then transit becomes unaffordable for the community to maintain. So
we have some people with their hands up that I hadn't seen because I had that part turned off. Ruby has her hand up.
Thank you, Carol. So, we're just kind of skirting around this question about whether it's really possible to have something akin to social housing, which I think the housing team has discussed in previous meetings some time ago, maybe. And, it recalls something that I am an El Cerrito resident who attended a talk by our mayor, Lisa Moriyama, a couple of weeks ago. And she just said in passing that we're never going to approach any kind of social housing because we have an economy that's market driven, not socially driven. So I think it's great what Sierra Club has done in some of these projects, but your answer about the extremely low income people phenomenon of they're selling rather gentrification taking over those kinds of housing. Is it really realistic to think that this approach that you have taken is going to significantly change the way or the tendency of the plans to be taken over by a system that doesn't serve low-income people? And I wish that weren't the case, but it seems as though these European experience that you're citing really reflect a different kind of economy from ours that is more socially conscious and less market driven.
I don't think it's fair to say that our economy is more market driven. I think that the answer is that we actually, and the fact of the matter is, the problem is that both we and the Europeans are managing their market, but we're doing a poorer job of doing that. So when we provide subsidies in the form of, say, Section 8, we're basically saying we're not going to build the housing. We're just going to let the market provide it, but we're going to provide these massive, we're going to give money to low-income people to try to find their way in the market. And then you've got all these zoning rules that discourage the development. And the result is you have money looking for homes that don't exist. And when you have a supply and demand function that has a big supply and a lack of demand, then prices go way up. And that's what we have here is high prices. In Europe, they actually are building the homes. And so what they're doing is they're adding homes to the market rather than and the result is that it pulls prices down, and then their housing isn't over too expensive. So they're actually managing their market more intelligently than we are. And it's possible for us to actually get better results following a model that looks a little more like Europe, both in terms of how we provide the housing and in terms of how we manage the labor markets. In Europe, they actually invest more in workforce development. So it's easier for people to get training that they need. And the result is that more people have higher incomes, which means they need less subsidy for housing. So because it's easier for them to afford it on their own. We're going to need that kind of bifurcated strategy that's looking both at creating a stronger middle class and that's providing that's actually constructing these low-income units and encouraging the expansion of the availability of housing. And if we're doing both of those things, then our market will do a better job of resolving on its own and creating the affordability we need. So the problem isn't that we have a market economy. The problem is that we're mismanaging it.
If I could just squeeze in, you've probably heard Mayor Matt Mahan of San Jose is planning to have these large number of small cottages built for the homeless. He says this is what helped the San Francisco homeless survive the earthquake in 1906. What do you think about his ideas?
Well, I am actually a big fan of the idea that homes are actually the antidote to homelessness. That housing first really is a good strategy. If you can get people into homes, then you can stabilize them in a lot of other ways. I actually am a huge fan of the combination of providing housing along with services. If you look at that project in downtown Berkeley that was built by Bridge Housing and Berkeley Food and Housing, this is doing just that. It's providing new homes, and it's also providing a broad suite of wraparound services that are essential to stabilizing that particular population. The homeless population is one that needs a lot of services. And if you're not doing that, if you're not providing all of those, you're not going to get good results. But if you do a really good job of stabilizing people, then you'll find that they actually have a lot fewer problems, that it's easier for them to maintain employment, that you end up having, it's easier to keep people healthy, to keep them from having substance abuse issues. There are all sorts of ways you can end up with better results if you're providing that broad suite of wraparound services. So and I think in San Jose that they're attempting to do that. So it isn't just about housing. It's about the combination of housing and services. This is a small piece of the affordable housing challenge. The homeless population is one small sliver of the larger population that needs affordable housing. We also need lots of housing for people who can't afford it because a teacher doesn't make enough to live here without excessive rent burdens. Even nurses have a hard time living here without that, etc. The trashmen, the janitors. There are lots of different classes of people that really need it, who we think of as being, well, they're well employed, but they just don't earn enough. And we need to figure out how to make it easy for them to actually live a good lifestyle too. And affordable housing is partly about that as well.
We have a couple more hands up here. One is from Kelly.
Oh, and
Okay. Hi, Tim. We're
before you,
neighbors.
It's
before
Kelly.
you start,
I recognize
Hey,
that
Tim.
voice.
Tim,
Yeah.
could you collapse your slide deck so we can see people more easily? Thank you.
So Tim, I'm on my iPad. My computer's in the store getting memory. So, I was, you come with a particular view about single family housing, which I don't see supported by much of the information that I read. And I did list a suggested book to read, The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy A. Brown. She's an accountant, and it's a wonderful book. And also, we have The Color of Law by Rothstein, on actually segregation in Berkeley, how Blacks were not allowed to buy into specific neighborhoods. So it's not parks, but one of the things that I thought you were going to cover tonight, and I didn't hear from you, is how we fit in nature with denser housing, because the urban settings, as we cover more and more land with mono agriculture, the cities are really important in biodiversity, and we are in a biodiversity crisis.
Yes.
And so what I didn't hear was how we put these buildings together and develop neighborhoods that also include biodiversity and support ecosystems and habitat. So could you speak to that?
I mean, just so you remember, in my description of the Roselated Village, I was pointing to the open space. And then when you look at the Bay Meadows specific plan, is the Bay Meadows 2 specific plan, as a matter of fact, that I was showing you an image of. There's 15 acres of habitat in that out of the 85 acres that were being redeveloped. And that was deliberately designed to actually meet the needs that environmentalists had determined that the city of San Mateo had, in terms of its open space, for open space of a variety of different types. You need some in larger format and some in smaller neighborhood pocket parks, et cetera. And so you had a combination of things in that project. I'm a big believer in being very careful about how we manage our parks and making sure that there's enough of them. I have spent much of a lot of time over the course of my career advocating for park bonds and things like that that are determined to actually that are designed to provide for these needs. And we need a common active open space, and that does not necessarily what you would think of as being habitat, but when we're looking at active open space, it can even include things like basketball courts and baseball fields and things like that. And that's really important in terms of human life. And if we're providing the quality amenities that make it attractive for people to live in the neighborhood and to live with higher densities, then we can actually keep highways and new development and new subdivisions from spilling on to lots of habitat out there, and can provide vastly larger amounts of real nature and of the kind that a lot of birds and other wildlife species and plant species all rely on. So this is partly about making sure that our urban areas don't take up as much space, so that more can be set aside for nature and more can be set aside for farms. And partly, and you're right, that it's important that we think about the details about how we utilize open space within an urban context to make sure that there is both good human habitat and good natural habitat. And those two are combined issues, right? Because humans actually do have a proclivity for communing with nature. And we need to make sure that low-income people, middle-income people, and high-income people all have good access to high-quality habitat so they can see what nature is like. We know that that's actually good for people. There's lots of studies around that. And so that means looking at their street tree programs. It means looking at the parks. And it also means making sure that there are the services and infrastructure is available to make access to our beaches, to larger landscapes where people can hike, etc., are also accessible to people of all types. And that means people of all incomes and people of all different types of ability. Because when seniors can no longer hike, they might still want to be able to have access to nature. And we need to make sure that there are some places where they can go, where they don't actually have to do something rigorous and physical to get out there and get close to nature.
We have, Tony has had her hand up for a long time, so let's try to get this in.
Hello, Tim and everybody. Good evening. I have to admire the amount of information you managed to pack into a rather short amount of time, much of which I agree with and some of which I disagree with. But factually, the main problem in your presentation, Tim, is that the built environment is in tabula rasa. I think you know what I mean. I mean, there isn't just space out there that we can build an ideal community every place we want to. So, there's land ownership and so forth. And there are market forces and there are other economic forces, as you well know. So if we reject the tabula rasa assumption, then we get into much more detailed discussion of any one of these topics. The other area that's also problematic, and it's also related to tabula rasa, is the complex history and culture behind a built environment, so that the easy comparison with Europe, for example, is highly questionable. And I speak as someone whose older brother, my late older brother, lived most of his adult life in Copenhagen, Denmark, and other places in Denmark. He was essentially a Danish-American businessman there. He was a great car mechanic, but he never owned a car in Denmark. He used public transit and bicycles. The reason that Denmark has, he was also the president of this cooperative housing association, which was a typical European style housing, 5 stories with an inner courtyard. I'm sure you're familiar with this model. Brilliant, absolutely wonderful housing, very cooperative, and a lot of collective feeling amongst the people, very happy people, the Danes, But the reason they have bicycle lanes is not because they're great outdoors people, which they are, but because they were occupied by Germany during the war, and nobody had any petrol after the war. Nobody, and so everybody rode bicycles, and they had to develop a bicycle infrastructure. So the infrastructure of the built environments is very much caught up in our history, which brings me lastly, my last point is American history. Zoning did not develop in the United States of America to enforce racial segregation. The impetus behind zoning was to separate housing residential uses from manufacturing uses. And the way things happened is that the upper and middle classes moved further away from manufacturing, and the working class lived down by the river, down by the railroad tracks, near the factories. But they also lived in single family houses. They were just a lot smaller. I grew up in a manufacturing town, I know what I'm talking about, and Berkeley is very, very similar in the history. It just so happens that zoning came in, and the development of urban America came in during segregation. In fact, zoning came in about 10 years after Plessy versus Ferguson. So it's coincidental, and it's not the raison d'etre of zoning. Racial segregation is not the raison d'etre. It is coincidental because zoning developed during racial segregation in this country. I'm 80 years old. I remember when Plessy was overturned. I was 11 years old when Brown came through. I was already reading the New York Times. It was a history in America that was devastating to Black people. Horrific, Jim Crow, a reign of terror, but it wasn't due to zoning.
Well, so you've raised a bunch of interesting questions about the tabula rasa. So, for instance, just to start with that, you're correct that if we want to look like Europe, we cannot do it overnight. It will have to be a very carefully sequenced suite of changes that we institute to actually get there. And it is a very complicated and tricky thing to do. There's no question about that. Now, as far as Europe is concerned, just take a look at Germany as an example. If you look at the challenge we face is mostly because of changes in our physical landscape in America that were introduced in the post-war period. The same thing happened in Germany, where for the first 20 years after World War II, because more or less Germany was managed by America and pushed in a direction of following the American example, Germany was actually building around the automobile. They were not investing in transit, and they were building more sprawling areas that just as we were. But in about 1970, they decided that was a really bad idea, and that they did not like what that was beginning to do to their country, and they turned around. And so they did what we ought to be doing, which is to say, they started building more inclusive neighborhoods. They started building around transit, and they went whole hog. And now, if you look at virtually every German metropolitan area, you're going to find that you can get by transit from any one neighborhood to any other neighborhood in the entire metropolitan area, because they've built around transit, they've built at higher density, and it works. And yes, you can get around by bicycle too, but Germany is also the place that has the very best roads and highways, etc. What they have shown is you can have that. You can have the automobile, but as long as you're not completely dependent on it, if you have choice, if you also have transit, if you also have bikes, if you also have great walkable neighborhoods, that works for everybody. And it's way, way more sustainable. And here's the interesting thing about it is it's also way more equitable. So the American landscape, I mean, I would challenge the notion that we weren't built around segregation, because you can look at the legislative record, you can look at just the way that the policies were deliberately woven together with single family zoning complemented by redlining. And if you read how redlining actually worked and how dependent it was on the zoning patterns that were associated with it, it all fit together as this one neat whole system that basically said African Americans, Asian Americans, brown Americans, and low-income white Americans had to live one place, and that wealthier white people got to live somewhere else. And we made investments in transportation infrastructure. We made investments in wastewater treatments and schools and everything that was deliberately biased towards providing more investment in segregated white neighborhoods and not in the places that had transit, not in the places that had apartments. And that ended up creating a tremendous amount of income inequality, and it created a pattern that is very, very difficult to break down. And what we're trying to do now is to figure out how to go back and fix all of that. And the good news is that it's doable. And the good news is that because so many people will benefit from doing this, because it will actually create a more productive economy. It will provide a landscape in which our taxes can pay for better government services because it uses funding more efficiently. I mean, it will provide a really broad suite of benefits. We could have more parks, we could have more all kinds of things, better education systems, we could have a stronger middle class if we decide that as a matter of policy, we are going to build different kinds of neighborhoods and we are going to manage employment in them in a different way, aimed at creating a more mixed use, better, stronger middle class, and more sustainable economy. I mean, we can have it all, but in order to do that, we have to recognize that there are real problems with the patterns of that we have embraced for the last 75 years.
You know,
I just want to say one thing. I can, I can talk on Blue Street, but I cannot out-talk you, Tim. You really, got it down. But Black people want to live in single family homes, just like white people. That's the way it is. Working class people want to live in single family homes if they have families. That's the way it's always been. The town I grew up in, everybody lived in a single family house. It was a blue collar town, Republican blue collar town. Everybody was white working class, except a few of us Jews, and no Black people. And you know why? Because a Black man was lynched on the corner of my block, and I didn't even know it in the late 19th century. And so the Black people didn't live in Port Jervis, New York, but there was a white working class and everybody lived in single family homes, and there was no zoning. Zoning wasn't even brought in until about 1960, after I graduated from high school. That town was unzoned. Most American towns were unzoned, and everybody lived in single family houses. That's just the way it was. People
folks,
live in houses.
wait,
That's it.
wait, just a moment. It is now 8 minutes after 9. I promised we'd start at 9. This is a fantastic discussion. And maybe, I mean, if everybody wants to keep going, I don't mind, but maybe we can carry this discussion to a housing committee, and Nick.
What I would recommend is that you let me make a closing statement and wrap this up in about 5 minutes. If that's okay with everybody, I would love to do that. So first of all, I want to actually, I think this is really important because I think a lot of people who live in single family homes worry that the critique of single family zones is that anybody that lives in a single family home is therefore racist. And that is not the case. The problem isn't with the individual single family home. The problem is with vast tracts where it's illegal to have a duplex, because that basically means that we have a complete monocrop of exactly one kind of home, and that the only determinant of price is location. And that creates a whole metropolitan landscape where we have an incredible amount of segregation by where you know what's desirable location versus an undesirable location. And we need a much greater diversity of housing types within every neighborhood if we want to break that down. And that means we have to allow people to have duplexes, we have to allow quadruplexes, et cetera. And I disagree with this notion that back in 1910, somehow there were huge tracts of land that were devoted exclusively to the single family home. If you look here at Berkeley, at the older neighborhoods, at the older housing stock that was built before the introduction of zoning, in almost every case, you're going to find a tremendous mix of single family homes, duplexes, quadruplexes, et cetera. And those small multifamily units actually allow of lesser means to live in the same neighborhood. They were sometimes called starter homes. But then after we put in zoning, we made it illegal to do that. And we created giant monocrops of only the more expensive type. And that was deliberately done to make sure that the only people who could live in the neighborhood were people who could afford that. So it meant, because when you have an entire neighborhood where the price of entry is that you have to be able to afford a mortgage, that means you're excluding all renters. That was the fundamental problem with single family zoning. We need to make it possible so that in residential neighborhoods, you can have both owners and renters living side by side. And you can do that in a way that doesn't necessarily dramatically change the shape of the neighborhood. It doesn't have to become high-rise development. You can actually introduce what they call missing middle housing, the kind of things that were once built in most areas where there were lots of single-family homes, but where you also had garden apartments and other things mixed in there. If we allow people to do that once again, we can reintegrate those neighborhoods. And the benefit will not just be that we have better integrated neighborhoods, but you'll have the kind of density that will actually support a market for transit. And then you can have transit. And when you have transit, then that makes things easier for people who can't drive, you know, and then maybe because they're low income and they can't afford the car, but also maybe because they've gotten older and they can't drive anymore. And in our neighborhood, and too many neighborhoods that don't have transit, when people get too old to drive, all of a sudden they're left with no choice but to leave the neighborhood. And that's really catastrophic on a social basis for people that confront that. And that doesn't happen so much in Europe. And in America, it's a crisis for people when they get old. If we actually do a better job of building mixed income neighborhoods, and that also have a higher density and that have a mix of transportation choices as well as housing choices, there are a whole suite, a broad array of people who will benefit from that and who will find those choices make it life just more practical for them. And that's something that is pretty broadly popular. What's really fascinating is if you look at the last 30 years of development and of policy around this in America, that there are as many red states as there are blue states where smart growth has become popular. And you'll find that this is something that is appealing to people across the full spectrum of ages. It's these smart growth techniques are popular across the full breadth of racial diversity. There is a lot of demand for this, and that's part of the reason why I'm hopeful, because we have people who are interested in social equity, people who are interested in the environment, and people who are interested in building a stronger, more competitive economy, who all agree that if we work together to build more socially equitable neighborhoods and socially equitable regions, that we will all be better off. And so that is a project that is going to require some cooperation between cities and counties and the states and the federal government all working together to bring our resources to bear on the question. But I see this actually happening. You look at the recent legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed with both Democratic and Republican support. There's a lot of money in that for infrastructure that will help us create a more sustainable set of regional economies all around the country. And that's exciting. And that is development, that is policy that was driven by some really courageous leaders. And I was very pleased to see the Biden administration achieving what I thought was a legislative a victory that is impressive in its scope, and really that hasn't been done since the New Deal era. If the total amount of investment we are beginning to make in America is huge, and I think it's been overlooked. People don't realize how much change has happened in just the last 4 years. I'm excited. I want to see my neighborhoods take advantage of the opportunity and to improve themselves. And I see it happening in Berkeley. I look at what's happening in Albany, and I see the development along San Pablo, and I applaud that as well. In Emeryville, you see the same thing happen. This is clearly something that has both broad support and a tremendous amount of stakeholder support that is I believe going to carry it through. And the momentum is there, and I thank you all for your attention tonight. This is an important issue, and it's one that if we continue to work on, we can make progress.
Thank you. This has been a very, very lively discussion, and in some other forum, it will be continued, like I said, maybe with Nick's and the Housing Committee. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tim, so much.
Okay, Nick.
Thanks, Tim. Take care, everybody.